Welcome back to After Order, a series from Macrodose and the Alameda Institute exploring power and crisis in today's unstable world. In this week's episode, we're turning to the concept of popular sovereignty. At a moment when the old order is breaking down, when states are unable to guarantee rights, stability, or even the basic conditions of life, what does it mean for movements, communities, and working people to build power for themselves? Joining me to explore that question is Gabriel Tupinambá, senior researcher at Alameda. In an upcoming paper titled Popular Sovereignties Under Peripheral Conditions, Gabriel looks to social movements, especially those in Brazil where he lives, to understand how communities are attempting to reclaim sovereignty on new terms. Gains that once seemed durable, access to land, political representation, legal recognition, now appear increasingly fragile. Right-wing forces are reorganising both inside and outside the state, and progressives are too often clinging to outdated institutions that have themselves become unstable. Under these conditions, Gabriel argues that we need to rethink sovereignty from the ground up. Not as a juridical status or as participation in a national project, but as something more material and immediate, the means of life itself, food, land, shelter, social reproduction, as the basis for any sustained political struggle. That idea opens up a series of urgent questions. Was the stability of the post-war period always more fragile than it appeared? Are the conditions long associated with the global periphery now becoming generalized across the world? And if movements today can still disrupt systems of power, why is it so much harder to build alternatives that last? All that and more in this week's After Order. Gabriel Tupinambá, welcome to After Order.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So I wanted to start with your upcoming paper for the Alameda Institute, where you talk about the Taste of Freedom Festival in 2025 in Bahia, which brought together, on your description, a pretty diverse group of landless labourers, of indigenous communities, of all sorts of people in this, what turns out to be a huge area of Brazil. But do you want to talk a bit more about what that was and the thinking behind it?
Sure. So the Taste of Freedom Festival was actually idealized by a militant from the landless workers movement called Neto Sankara. He also worked with the Webs of the People, which is a network of many, many movements in Brazil. And Neto is also an associate in Alameda. And he was the one who brought up the idea that given the current context of land struggles in Bahia, which is both very heterogeneous in its origins, but it's also facing very kind of acutely the problem of, both paramilitary forces, which are now threatening land occupations, have been established for many years, but also new contexts like, for example, Bahia is being very, very targeted for the presence of rare earths today. So they anticipate also what's coming in the future. Due to all of this, the idea that he had was to bring together different communities from this actually very, very wide region, very distinct communities, peasant communities, quilombola territories, which are kind of Black liberated territories, indigenous peoples, to discuss and strategize, okay, what type of material conditions we need to be able to approach the challenges we're going to face in terms of self-defense, in terms of imposing our demands, and achieving some type of just advancement of our movement under a situation where we now have had a decade of realizing we can't really rely that just because we elected somebody, because a law was passed, that these paramilitary forces, that this kind of different groups and even the police itself won't simply put all of this aside and come at us again. So it was interesting to see that such a complex strategic political motivation actually led them to organize a festival that was centered on food sovereignty and sort of discussion on which type of qualitative relation to the land they must have in order to secure the means for pursuing these struggles.
I want to pick up on this point about food sovereignty, because you quote in the same paper, Neto Sankara is saying that if, I'm going to paraphrase a bit here, but if I have food sovereignty for a year, I can be rebellious for a year. And it's the idea of food as sort of foundational to what sovereignty could be and what it might mean to talk about this. I suppose I'm asking here about if you can describe a bit more how or why you end up with food as the foundation for what sovereignty looks like, and perhaps in putting it into the context of not just in the global north, any number of countries around the world. You can think about the Middle East, across Africa, where countries are significantly import dependent on food. I mean, UK is significantly import dependent for food. To immediately raise the question of food sovereignty in a world where large numbers of people live in places that are import dependent, they have to import more food than they can grow, is to suggest that sovereignty is always going to be constrained, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a really important question. I mean, and also I think it helps with the second part of your first question, which is I didn't really go into, okay, but what does it mean to extrapolate such a specific scenario? I think that's the perfect segue, because I think that there are two levels to this. The first is I think that the way that I hear Neto's ideas is from a very, very pragmatic point of view. Is not imagining a future conflict. This is the kind of balance of an experience of 20 years of facing. I mean, Neto grew in a MST settlement where in 20 years they had, I think, 25 attempts at removing them. So that was like a constant for them. So the question of food sovereignty, I think that first of all, it's a concrete answer to a concrete situation where it's connected to feasibility. It's not connected to some type of ideal of let's just isolate ourselves in this and we have everything we need. But I mean, what are the material conditions for that in most places of the world? So I think that the first point is just that it's pragmatic, makes sense for a region where you could achieve that. Again, but what that means, again, why then host a meeting with so many communities? Because even in that case, it's not a matter of isolation and full self-sufficiency. They make a very, very strong cases to separate self-sufficiency from sovereignty, right? So sovereignty in Neto's approach, but the approach of especially the webs of the people more generally, it's connected to interdependence that brings about political recognition. So it's not that you need to be self-sufficient, but that you need to be able to rely on those that will kind of increase your own political autonomy and not make a bargain where you get what you need by undoing your own political development. So a lot of what the festival was about was also bringing together producers from different regions and mapping what they have and what they need. So it's not really about it's not a conversation that only makes sense in context where you have access immediately to sufficient needs and so on, right? But the second part of this, which I think it's more important, and I think it's something to go back to in different aspects, is that I think that what's really, really worth extrapolating from this type of example is a kind of approach. I mean, when you go to situations where you have really diverse constraints and that you can't really kind of single out one parameter that you need to optimize in order to win, that means you need to have a more complex model, right? And you can take that to another situation and you'll just see how those parameters apply. So you don't need to export the solution. You can export the framework, I guess. So the question of which in certain contexts looks like a sort of inversion of saying, well, rather than struggle in order to achieve certain things, you need to be able perhaps to find kind of precarious ways of achieving some of these things in order to be able to endure certain struggles for longer and so on. So that's a more general conclusion. It requires a different type of analysis, perhaps, that's won't necessarily look the same in different places. I actually enjoy a lot seeing conversations that Neto has with, for example, workers and militants in large metropolis talking about, okay, so we're going to build our own, gardens and agricultural areas in the city. And he says, like, what are you doing? Like, makes no sense. Why would you do that? So it's definitely not a sort of romantic call for autonomy. And I think that it's worth also revising why it is that the discussion of political autonomy has become so attached to this idea of complete self-sufficiency. right? So that's also something worth examining.
I mean, I want to pick up on the webs of the people, this what would you call it, a network, yeah, or a movement that Sankara and yourself been working with. As you describe it, it sounds it's a very heterogeneous collection of the MST, so it's landless labourers, indigenous territories, people, as you mentioned, in the cities, like lots and lots of different, not necessarily obviously congruent groups brought together, which you describe. And again, it's quoting Sankara at this point that, we are different, we are in different territories, but we have the same enemies and the same goals. Now, at first pass, this sounds an awful lot like a kind of, and you're going back a few decades now, actually, but this is Antonio Negri, Michael Hart. This is the multitude. This is lots and lots of different people pointing in lots of different ways, but generally working together in some form, which they always attached quite explicitly to the idea that sovereignty had basically ended, that you had empire, this one universal sort of form across the world in which questions of sovereignty would no longer exist. So it feels to me like there's a differentiation here. But is that fair, that you're trying to attach something that sounds a little bit like an older, to my ears, form of sort of anti-capitalist global justice movement discourse and analysis, and then tying it next to this new concern with sovereignty, something that's really reappeared in the last sort of decade or so?
Yeah, I think that you've touched on a really complicated challenge there. I mean, my own, just to clarify this, right? My own relation with the Webs of the People is as a external supporter, is nothing compared to Neto, Joelson, Erasto, all other militants and intellectuals in the movement that I think are really kind of elaborating on these ideas. But what I think it's a really important challenge in what you're saying is that, I mean, generally, when you have some sort of hegemonic idea, you also have the kind of hegemonic counter idea. And I guess that in the same period that we had, for different reasons, a strong reliance on some sort of what I like to call the convergence thesis, the idea is that whatever we're doing by some underlying necessity, anti-capitalist struggles will go towards the same form, the same goals, and so on. You also had the kind of negative version of this, which I think the multitude for a while was this idea of forget the forms, forget this kind of programmatic unitary vision. There is something more fluid, more dynamic, more polymorphous that already has this form somehow. You can trust this somehow. And I don't think that this has really anything to do with the Webs of the People, because if Teia dos Povos, right, the Webs of the People is anything, it's a very, very complex movement, or they don't call themselves the movement, but articulation or network that 90% of the problems they face is having to navigate this heterogeneity. Heterogeneity doesn't come with commonality.
Yeah.
And I think on that point, it already breaks with the kind of more Negrian approach, where there will be some sort of inference that where you foster difference, you foster kind of this diversity, you also are fostering cooperation. And that's even where people want to cooperate. That doesn't mean you get it for free.
Yes.
And I think that in particular, in the case of the Webs of the People, they have the best kind of laboratory for this, or the best opportunity for this, because they also break away, I think, with another very romantic assumption, which is that if you're struggling or fighting in conflict with capitalist structures from a kind of boundary position, like indigenous peoples who are resisting commodification of their land and labor and so on, that if you're on the other side of that form, you have a common form. But that makes no sense. And anthropologists will tell you that, there are as many ways of organizing as there are indigenous peoples. There's no common form, even if you can say that they rely more on kinship structures or whatever. So to actually come up with a forum, a kind of assembly space, a strategic space of debate for that degree of heterogeneity implies a totally different approach than this sort of more Negrian multitude approach. So I think that's the first point. So, but what that leads you is to different types of problems, which I think the first thing is, which I think it's very healthy, very refreshing. It's kind of implicit in that formulation from Neto that you mentioned, but perhaps too implicit, which is because you can't really come up with a common horizon. I mean, there's very little in common in the way that precarious worker who lives in a favela in a large city in Brazil the way that they see the world and what they need compared with indigenous populations struggling just to keep their land and so on. They don't share very much. So they don't avoid calling themselves a movement because they believe in some sort of amorphous force. It's just because you need to actually clean the field to focus on work you can actually do together. If they manage to find something they can do, then there is convergence in that particular point. Now, will that convergence build to a bigger convergence or not? You need to do that thing first and then see. You can't anticipate it because even the forms of deliberation are totally different, the rhythms of deliberation. So I think that it's more of a, it's funny, if you read the original documents from the Webs of the People, they were evaluating the limits of the landless workers movement and saying we focus too much on quantity of land and a juridical approach to this to achieving further occupations. But then when we have setbacks, we can't really produce in anywhere that we're living always with the same kind of production culture. So you can't have such a quantitative relation. And second, the state kind of covers the Brazilian territory in very uneven ways. So in some places you can rely on this, some other places you can't. So it was a military strategy to create alliances with indigenous peoples, quilombolas people, because it would create a different relation to the land where that was needed. And because you need those alliances for self-defense. So it's very materialistic, very pragmatic, even though the content that suddenly you need to kind of include in your assessment and how you think strategy and other things changes so much that it brings it closer perhaps to more romantic ideas from 20, 30 years ago, I guess.
I mean, I suppose that's kind of answered one of the questions that was forming in my head, which is then if you're also heterogeneous, why would you bother talking to people who are so dissimilar from yourself? Mm-hmm. And I suppose you've made the point that this is a kind of a purely political or political military calculation, a strategic calculation, that you need to go and talk to someone else. So this is an alliance you can build on a kind of temporary basis. But it also feels to me that like you've potentially suggested going even further than Hart and Negri did in terms of pursuing this, you might want to call it anti-Marxist, or at least anti a certain kind of Marxism, where you say that there is no necessary convergence, as you called it, right? The pattern of capitalist development is not one that hammers everyone into roughly the same kind of proletarian-shaped hole, and you all end up in about the same place, and you all therefore have a common unity, and therefore you've got some ability to overthrow. I think you're suggesting something even less than Hart and Negri still retained of that, which is to say that actually there is no commonality at all apart from the immediate political situation you find yourself in. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the kind of consolidation of a certain how we call this, like not a feeling, but a sense that okay, there is something we can no longer rely on if we ever could. I think that's true, and I think it's actually something you can see spanning across very different political movements in Brazil and elsewhere. I think that it's the correlate of a new attention to problems of political articulation. And I would say it actually, the way that I've formulated perhaps a bit pedantically, is that just because you have a universal stake doesn't mean you have a common form. I think that's the core idea. Like, does it mean that wage workers don't have a universal perspective and universal stakes? Of course they do. Does that mean that every struggle they pursue will achieve a common form by necessity? I think not. And I think that a lot of movements are getting to that conclusion in different ways. Is this anti-Marxist? I would say not. I would say that, in my opinion, a Marxist position is one where if there is convergence, then there is convergence. If there is not, there is not. We should be able to assess this from the critique of political economy, from the actual resources we have. I mean, why would there? I don't think that from Marx analysis, it directly stems the assumption that I actually think that if you take, I don't know, to be a bit nerdy, if you go for like the law of accumulation implies increase in pauperization. Pauperization implies that we rely more and more on different forms of social reproduction. If we rely on more different forms of social reproduction, we have heterogeneous forms of social reproduction. So it would imply further accumulation, further heterogeneity, not further homogeneity. I think that if there is a debate on how to read Marx, that means it's Marxist, right? So I think that it would qualify. But I do agree that one of the consequences of there not being a strong Marxist kind of reevaluation, reconstruction of categories, political economy, to think all these things, is facilitating the distancing, which I think it's a problem, because those are the categories that are still the best categories to think about urban struggles of, large masses of workers. So if you allow these things to drift apart and you're not interested in finding where they speak to one another, I think that we're going to get an even worse situation for finding means of articulation. So that's also something I'm very interested. That's why I have the little nerdy parentheses there, because it's something interesting a lot on how do we unify this theoretically, at least,
Well, there's a kind of, there's different traditions around either explicitly Marxist or close to it that do talk about how heterogeneity can produce a form of convergence, right? You mentioned one, explicitly in the paper you talk about the peripherization thesis, that broadly, to summarize, I suppose, the idea that what you might see sitting in the global north as the collapse of social forms and social organization, the breakdown of many things that seem stable, looks, if you're in the south, as this is a generalization of conditions you already have. The real condition of capitalism isn't the relatively organized, stable system you see in the north. It's in fact the sort of more chaotic, uncertain situation you have in the south. And there's potentially sort of political conclusions to draw out of that. The other one I think of is combined and uneven development and its attachment to political strategies. Most obviously associated with Leon Trotsky, and although before him, help hand Alexander Pavus, writing about the Russian Revolution, the coming Russian Revolution at the time, and dealing with the problem of a very small working class in a very large, mostly peasant country. So how do you make this heterogeneity of different things suddenly work as a kind of revolutionary or political organization? So it's not an uncommon problem to think about this, but it does all suggest that, and you do say this, I think, in the paper, and I think it's the right point, which is that the assumption of stability, the assumption that the stable version of capitalism we've kind of had for the last, let's say in the global north, 70 odd years, give it the maximum length, was in fact a blip in capitalist development. That really the thing has always produced heterogeneity, has always produced divergence, has always produced instability.
Yeah, I think that this is something that is, again, another one of the challenges that I think we need to face, because yes, there are so many different traditions aligned and in dialogue with Marxism, for example, that are examining, again, uneven and combined development, all these different ways that heterogeneity can both play a crucial role in capitalist forms of accumulation and also be taken into consideration as necessary parts of political struggle and strategy. So that's definitely a very long history. I think that what is perhaps new about the peripherization thesis as developed in Brazil from the 70s, 80s on by thinkers like Francisco de Oliveira, later on Paulo Arantes, but it's a long tradition in a way. I think it's this idea that it's at least trying to explicitly give another twist to dependence theory, especially in the interpretation that people like Celso Furtado would give of it, which is slightly more reliant on the idea that, well, if this gives us the side of international struggle, equal exchange, and all these things, then we know what we need to do. There is a certain, let's say, if we're not just being pulled by advanced societies to go through what they're going through later on, well, then going through these things, it's actually part of our own political project. There's a kind of developmentalist strategy that is actually now more autonomous than before. And I think that the main thesis, the main kind of critique that this peripherization thesis tries to propose is that, well, we're not lagging behind at all. In fact, we're a laboratory of very advanced ways that capitalism is integrating. They say things like, archaic forms are gaining new functions in capitalist relations, and capitalist relations reproducing these archaic forms because they are totally integrated. So you have platformization and evident return of, slave-like work conditions, and they they go very well together and so there's all of that. But I think that the issue with this is that if you look at the politics that comes out of peripherization approaches, I think that it has the refreshing, I would put it like this, it has the merit of looking at some type of analyses that were proposed in the global north. For example, I think of someone like Mark Fisher, and these ideas of we're looking at the cancellation of the future, our political imagination is blocked, and things like this, and a certain recognition, but with a hard kind of, it's hard to find exactly where it's stemming from, if not from a kind of ideological pressure from the return of the extreme right. From the standpoint of peripherization, you could understand this as well as the conditions from the global south start to kind of seep into other societies that haven't necessarily experienced that in that way. You suddenly find yourself defending what you had instead of proposing new things, and that changes this conservative, like progressivism looks a bit more conservative all of a sudden. The terrain has shifted, so you don't know how to imagine advancing in that terrain. It's hard to tell what belongs to a new stage of capitalist development and what is actually something that is being built by the right. So all these things become a problem. And the issue is that even though that this is interesting as a kind of framework to analyze again some of these earlier diagnoses, I think that it's still, and this is where I would think that our theories need to move forward. It's still a problem to recognize what type of order is leading this. We should be able to talk about peripheral capitalism as an ordered system and not as the space of chaos and disorder, because that's not really what it is. To the point that it's the same people who spoke about, like Roberto Schwartz, this Brazilian Marxist critic who used to talk about the Latin Americanization of core countries, he would also say that, well, where you have peripheral social conditions, you see capital at work more clearly. It's easier to see its abstract force, where it's not kind of hidden behind counter forces that force it into the law, force it into certain communitarian forms, right?
I mean, I'm glad you mentioned Mark Fisher, because he's someone who became very, very popular, particularly in sort of English-speaking world and sort of left movements, English-speaking world, for capitalist realism. His book, people have picked up and read, and some pithy phrases about the slow cancellation of the future, and a generally a very well written, quite compelling argument about the imagination necessary to see beyond what we have has just sort of disappeared. This is capitalist realism. But if you go and look at his actual political commitments, like what did he want to do instead? What would a Mark Fisher program look like? And he did produce these things at various points. I mean, often in collaboration with other people. It never particularly got beyond saying, wasn't post-war social democracy pretty good, really, right? And let's do some more of that. So you have this kind of slow cancellation in the future. And the response to that is to say, let's wind the clock back a bit over the last few decades. I don't want to sort of parody or stereotype too much, but it's quite striking that the limits, even Mark Fisher's writing, is to say there isn't much beyond that point. I mean, one of the bits I thought was quite compelling in your own argument was a discussion of how post-war welfare states in the global north, particularly in Europe, so Britain, across Western Europe especially, were a kind of bargain struck with workers where they would subcontract or outsource their sovereignty to the state in return for kind of some forms of stability and an appearance of power for a brief period, which lasted for about as long as the state was willing to carry on doing that, because you've outsourced your sovereignty. And then if that is removed, if the state turns around, as it kind of did from the mid-70s onwards, across Western Europe and across North America most notably, accelerating across the world after that point for sure, then you were suddenly left very exposed, that you kind of lost what had been built quite rapidly, and you weren't left with whatever sovereignty you used to be able to claim. Like the workers' movements you used to have are hollowed out shells of their former selves, and you don't have any sense of what you might do instead because you don't have that sovereignty. So I suppose there's a question here about whether social democracy, as we've seen it in Europe and maybe in Latin America, or at least bits of it, is now just finished, and we need to think about, in particularly fundamentally, what new forms of sovereignty might look like.
Yeah, that's a huge question. And in Brazil, I think that part of Alameda's research on popular sovereignty involved commissioning a research on the struggles of courier drivers, motoboys, and delivery app workers in Brazil, who managed to build a very strong movement, which I think it's even more is even stronger for the fact that it faced challenges that are very telling. And in this research, I think the paper is called "Infrastructure of Refusal." They examine that there is a disproportion that it's very kind of striking between the capacity of delivery app workers, for example, to stop large cities, and they became such essential workers for, especially in the pandemic. But beyond that they can actually bring huge companies to a halt with actually quite punctual actions and so on. But in a strange way, this power doesn't really translate in a capacity to negotiate better conditions, because the waiting game that sets up once you produce this kind of big halt of a city falls almost exclusively on them. They don't have the means to endure the type of struggle that they themselves create. And in a way, I think that this is, you could interpret this as this kind of paradigmatic schism between kind of disruption and construction. And of course, the two things are related, and it's been it is a problem for any political movement to be able to navigate these two things. But I think what makes their case slightly different and very connected to what you said is that if you then tell them something like, well, but then you need a union, you need to unionize in such a way that you can build this power, and they will say no. The relation of the delivery app workers with the just formalization of their category and their profession and the building, they distrust this, because what they, and at least one of the reasons for sure, is that they saw the crumbling of this political instrument in such a way that they now are more willing to see what they can do without them than just think that backtracking is something that's gonna, again, to go back to that Fisher idea that perhaps in the face of this catastrophe, we need more of what we had. They don't seem to have that nostalgia, but then they make it very explicit the type of problem that they face. Okay, but then where is this capacity to endure going to come from? And I think that this boils down, in my impression, looking at different political movements in Brazil and elsewhere. I think it boils down deep down to the problem of the conflict between labor and militant work. The fact that both need to take a share of your time and your resources. And to the point that perhaps we didn't anticipate to the degree that we should, how, if you don't have the conditions to have minimal free time, you don't have conditions to sacrifice your free time for political purposes. And I think that's a very old problem, found many different solutions. But if you go through the history of revolutions and political processes in general, I feel like you can always find the moment where there is some type of partial solution to this. I'm thinking, again, you mentioned the Russian Revolution and so on. I mean, the way that you can see solutions to the problem of peasants in 1917 and what they're going to do with their crops. Are they going to send it to the lords or whatever it's called or not? And the way that the Bolsheviks support them in a certain crucial moment that's going to conciliate these two sides, and then becoming a problem in the next moment. So this question of production and reproduction of the struggle itself, I think that now it's becoming very evident that you don't need to have access to land and to be in the rural area to pose the problem of how, the conditions of your reproduction determine in some degree how far you can take a struggle, right? And the type of problem that this produces, which I think it's also particularly relevant, is that, again, if the peripherization thesis helps shedding a new light, perhaps, on problems that we face in radical politics in the global north, the first useful thing to me is that it takes away a bit of the strength of arguments that think fragmentation on the left stem from neoliberal individualist ideology, or at least from that alone. Because the moment that you can't make sure that your sacrifice and the time that you spend doing politics is not taking time from your life. The moment that conflict is in the forefront, the amount of struggles within the left that you get, because everything is just so much harder, and everyone else is creating a kind of a obstruction that you simply don't have time to deal with, diplomatically or whatever. So I think that you get a chance to perhaps develop a kind of political economy of militant life as well from this type of question.
I mean, this is the problem of socialism being too many meetings, I think how Oscar Wilde once put it, right? But this is a long-standing sort of issue for any kind of organization for as long as industrial capitalism in particular has been around, and there's two versions of solutions to it. One of them, and it's a bit of a freighted term, but one of them is a labor aristocracy, or at least better paid workers who have more free time and therefore more capacity to organize. And you can go through, certainly in the 20th century, the sort of big massive labour upset. So end of the First World War, coming to the 60s and the 70s, it is classically the better paid workers who are leading the movements against the First World War at the end of the First World War and carrying on into the 20s. It is car workers who are the most militant you find across Western Europe and North America in the 60s into the 70s, right? These are people who are kind of well paid, right? And they're really well organized, and they're not like the poorest, most desperate people in the working class at the time. And that's partly why they have some capacity to do this. The other version of the solution, the one that I think has now really come to the fore, is bureaucratization, that you create a bureaucracy, you outsource your ability to organize to someone else. The trade unions very rapidly, as soon as they're legalized, in Germany, in France, in Britain, they start to establish this version of a trade union bureaucracy that will do some of this organisation work. And we have a kind of version of it now with NGO land and any number of people rattling around lots of different organisations where it is a full-time bureaucracy that is being paid by subs to organise. These are versions of solutions to that problem. None of them seem particularly satisfactory in a world where absolutely everyone is being hammered out into something like this. You do not have very much free time. You do not have very much money. You have very few other resources. None of these older 20th century leading into 21st century solutions appear to be able to work there. But what have people come up with instead? I mean, if you're advising, if you're going to sit here and tell people in the global north what they could be doing and what they might learn from some of these movements in the south, what would it start to look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to the extrapolating question. How could you generalize from these discussions? I mean, I think that just to summarize what we've kind of glossed over here, like you can see that even though this festival and the concerns that NATO and other comrades there have about sovereignty and autonomy, they don't share much immediate, even within Brazil, they don't share much ground with delivery app workers in the city. But at the same time, you see, for example, another militant who is also a very important intellectual in Brazil now called Paulo Galo, who is himself a delivery worker, learning from, he visited and he has good relations with the Webs of the People and other militants there. And his conclusion was, well, maybe rather than having, I mean, there is still some kind of a low curve of, collective action for disruption. The cost of proposing certain actions still not very high, because you are sometimes an essential worker. You have some power of disruption. The cost is much higher when you need to cooperate to endure, because you don't see the benefits of that. It's not necessarily gonna, like, caring for the reproduction of a struggle doesn't necessarily come with the immediate benefit, right? So the curve of what you need to the lump you need to go through, it's much harder. So, for example, he came up with this idea that maybe we need a sort of rear guard organization rather than a vanguard. Coming up with disruptive strategies, something that you can kind of trust spontaneous struggles and revolts to produce some of it. But we're not really managing to withstand the ups and downs of revolt for long enough to see what would appear. And I feel like in the desperation of having to give form to these things, or the desperation that they will never have some form, and if we support this indefinitely, something bad is going to come. It's going to be taken up by the right wing or whatever. We want to have a clear horizon too early on, like a program or something to just throw on top of these things. And the idea of a rearguard party, as far as I understand Galo's proposal, is, well, maybe left-wing forces who have some resources should pull these resources into guaranteeing that these things can go on for long enough for them to have the means to self-determine what the hell they want to do. It's a different idea. I think it rather than assuming that if that kind of popular form, that kind of clear sense of demand is not emerging, that it's an inherent property of these new struggles. But if you have such a deep problem with the material reproduction of struggle, maybe they don't have time enough to produce this. And in that desperation, we will ultimately revert back to the solutions that you just suggested, right? Labor aristocracy, bureaucratization, NGOization, or whatever we call it, right? So I think that there is no model in what's going on that can be exported. The conditions are very diverse. I think that the fact that there are perhaps more parameters to consider is useful. And I think those challenges, such as the one that Gallo is putting in these terms, I think those are useful challenges more than solutions, perhaps.
There was an anarchist fanzine produced in Huddersfield in the late 1990s and early 2000s called Rearguard Action, which I think is a nice example of some parallel thinking perhaps emerging in unexpected parts of the world. But Gabriel Tupinambá, thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, it was a pleasure.